Hey everyone, how y'all doing today? Trying something a little bit different today. We're going to do this talk outside. The lighting is so much better, and we're going to continue part two with libertarian anarchism. So last lecture we sort of talked about what libertarian anarchism was. Again, it's the idea that it's an ideology that calls for the serious reduction of state power. In the case of libertarians, they want a very minimal state, really, again, just to honor contracts in a capitalist economy and to provide usually national defense. And it stops there for most libertarians. Anarchists want to see the entire state, along with the capitalist system, done away with. Not necessarily doing away with free markets, though, but the capitalist system as we know it today. Now, one question that's commonly brought up to many critics, many critics will bring up to anyone kind of has more libertarian or anarchist beliefs is, okay, so if we were to get rid of the state tomorrow, what would society even look like? Are there any alternatives that could possibly even exist other than the state? And admittedly, it's quite difficult to even conceive of such a world because we've become so dependent upon the state. But one common thing that people forget is that for the majority of our history, we didn't actually have states. For about 95% of our history, we lived in pre-state societies. This is before kings, before monarchs, before all the conquistadors introduced the ideology of state power, right? So of course we're talking about a type of system that's predicated more on indigenous styles of living, right? So for example, back in the day, Native Americans lived in a non-state society, and most indigenous cultures did. Now, an important thing to know is just because you don't have a state doesn't mean it's going to be total anarchy. So in a lot of ways, the term anarchism is kind of a negative term. It suggests that there's no order. That's not true. You can still have order, a social order, but without authority or state power, right? So the Native Americans, they didn't have cops, they didn't have judges, they didn't have Congress, they didn't have the presidency, they didn't have a recognized court system or national bank like we know today, like the Federal Reserve, but they still kept order because they had what? Good morals, and they had tremendous respect for their elders who carried much weight in their communities. So, in contemporary times, what do we have that could possibly be an alternative to the state? Do we have any examples? Well, we do. Many intentional communities, and there's about 10,000 of them as we speak, scattered throughout the United States. An intentional community usually revolves around a group of individuals who knowingly and with intent decide to live off the land. They provide their own water, through rainwater collection apparatus. They grow their own food through homesteading or through farming, right? They make their own internal rules through direct democracy, which of course we've talked a lot about in here. Usually these communities, they build all their own housing, what we might call eco housing out of materials from the earth that are seen as very sustainable. Think like rooftop gardens. And these kind of communities are very interesting. I've visited a couple on my own accord, one that I stayed at for a period of time. The one I'm going to speak to is The Farm, which is a hippie commune or intentional community in Tennessee, about an hour from Nashville, Tennessee, that's been in existence since the early 1970s. And these communities, for all intents and purposes, they've even been able to avoid taxation, right? Through registering either as a nonprofit or as a church, right? So they don't even have to pay taxes. So own land, provide their own water, provide their own electricity, right? Through usually solar power. So these types of communities would be an example of a non-state society. Again, there's no apparatus of violence within their communities, nor is there any kind of like falling back on taxation. That doesn't exist. These communities don't have police. They don't have court systems. Usually they're too far outside the purview of the major cities to be seriously regulated by local governments. The most state intervention these types of intentional communities will be subject to usually is property taxes on the land to the local governments. But beyond that, they don't really engage with the state very much, right? So, you know, you know, are we likely to see these types of communities emerge on a mass scale? Most likely not. People enjoy their comforts. They like going to the supermarket. Most people will pay taxes in order to have their recycling and their trash taken for them. Most people will engage with the banking system, look to their jobs provided for by the state. But it is possible. But it revolves on a couple key principles. One is self-sufficiency. Another concept is mutual aid. Mutual aid just means that you have trust in community, that if one person's in trouble, you come to their aid, knowing that if you get in trouble, they come to your aid, right? So in order to move beyond a state, we have to have a lot of trust in each other. Let me give you an example, actually, building off that, of a common question that anarchists are usually presented with, of how would you provide welfare for your people if the state's not involved in that? Let's say you lose your job or you get disabled at your work. What can you look to if we don't have the state? Well, there was a system that was done in the 1800s, and unions. This is interesting. The unions back then, everybody belonged to a union. So let's say you were a carpenter, or you were an electrician, or you were a builder. You belonged to a trade, a factory. You belonged to a trade union, and every paycheck, there was a box that would be left, a voluntary contribution box, and you could give as little or as much as you wanted into the box. And the box went towards workers who suddenly found themselves unemployed or who got hurt, disabled on the job. Now, interestingly enough, the box was always filled, right? In study after study, historians have found that any union that used this box system, this contribution system by voluntary donations, it was always well more than enough money to feed everybody, and the theory behind that was, I may not be hurt now, but I better donate now because the expectation is down the road I may get hurt on the job, and then I can pull from the donation box later on. That idea that I better contribute because it could be me one day is a very strong impulse, right? So that's one theory of how welfare could be handled, is through voluntary contributions within our communities. And that obviously depends on trust, right? So I hope this is kind of interesting. If you guys want to find out more about self-sustaining intentional communities, there's a website online. You can just type in the U.S. Intentional Communities Database, Intentional Communities Database. And if you pop it up, it'll show all the different communes and intentional communities throughout the U.S. There are many, 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 many people who are trying to get more kind of off the grid and to not have to live under a state. So take a look. You guys might find it interesting. Much peace to you all. Be well.